We have a great panel here. The panel is very desirous that this be interactive, so we'll actually be taking questions as we go. You'll see that we're sort of broken into segments, and I'll kind of look up and look around and invite the questions. But also, if you have a question or a comment, go ahead and let it rip. So these are just great people. We all had dinner last night. We had so much fun. It was really great. This is Rebecca Rimel, who is the head CEO of the Pew Charitable Trusts, which is quite a mouthful, and we're going to actually talk about that mouthful for quite a bit here, and it's a very important position. She comes, you were trained as a nurse, you have an MBA, you're from the public health space, but the Pew Charitable Trusts are doing so much. You probably know about the Pew Opinion Research, and if you listen to NPR, I think that you're a big sponsor of that, and they are in the law space. They're very active in access to justice, national food policy, all kinds of things the Pew is doing, and that's really exciting. And then next to Rebecca is the General Counsel and Vice President of the Pew Charitable Trust, Jim McMillan, who graduated from Harvard. They have a law school. He has.
They do.
Okay. And he's done a lot of different things, and we'll talk about that a little bit too, because it's kind of interesting the way in which one's career unfolds. And then next to Jim is the great Joel Fleischman, a law professor and professor of public policy, and he's generally over at the Sanford School, which he is the originator of, and is a wonderful Duke citizen, and probably the world's leading expert on foundations and the nonprofit sector. So the two of us are going to be moderating, and we thought we would begin by talking about the Barnes litigation. Some of you probably actually interested in the title of this, but we'll get to that a little bit later. We're going to talk about the Barnes litigation, then we're going to talk about the conversion of Pew from being whatever it was, a private foundation, to being a public charity, which is the reason that the title of this program has creativity in it, because this is a very creative move that opened up a lot of things. It was a very astute legal move by someone, perhaps by you, Jim.
Preceded my time.
Okay, so then you can just you sing the praises of your office without seeming to be praising yourself. And then we thought we would talk about what the Barnes is currently doing, and as I say, we're open to discussion and that sort of thing. So should we start with the Barnes? Do you want to lay the foundation?
I have a prior question. Rebecca said I should ask a provocative question.
We aren't even started.
My provocative question is, there are 4 donors to the Pew Charitable Trust who created 7 different trusts, right? Why did they choose to create separate individual trusts at the beginning rather than pool it and have just one trust?
So would counsel advise me to address that or to defer?
I think you should defer it. Why don't you defer that? It's a really good question, because we're going to talk about the organization of Pew. We'll do that second. So let's talk about the Barnes. And the provocative question ought to be this. Does everybody know about the Barnes Foundation and the Barnes Museum in Philadelphia? This wonderful museum that has an immense number of French Impressionist paintings and Matisse. And it was created by Albert Barnes, who developed the drop that they put into babies' eyes, and he made a fortune in the early part of the 20th century, bought all this art, and then tied it up in a mansion out in Marion, Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia, with all kinds of restrictions on public access. It was going to be a school, and eventually the Barnes Foundation ran out of money, and the citizens, sort of, I suppose, the arts community and others, thought, we need to break this will, or this trust, and move this wonderful collection into the city. And that just began a kerfuffle.
Kerfuffle is a good way to put it. Well, I'm delighted to be here. I am sitting between 2 legal legends and 2 people who have committed their life to public service. My dear friend, Joel Fleishman, and my new friend, your dean. They have many lessons to teach, and I hope that you all take advantage of that. We had a lot of fun dealing with that at dinner. I'm sure everyone in here has about 72 lawyer jokes. I don't have any because I've come over my career to highly respect and understand what a brilliant legal mind can do in speaking truth to power and helping organizations like mine and many others right wrongs and be innovative and creative in using the law productively to serve the public interest. So count me as a fan, and particularly for those of you who might be contemplating a career in public service or in the civic space. So to your question, the Barnes. So I became involved really in 1999, 2000. The Barnes, with a art collection that some have said is valued at, 50 billion, could be 70 billion, no one knows. They were bankrupt because of some of the restrictions that have been put in place by their benefactor. Art was walking out the door. Forensic audit showed that money was also being, if not misappropriated, poorly used. So we were approached about bailing them out, just paying the bills to keep the lights on and some security in the building. Probably not a great move on our part, but we said, yeah, we'll basically do that. But we want to find a permanent solution. So my first call was to the Assistant Attorney General, wonderful guy, Larry Barth. He is the hero in this story, and you'll never see his name. And said, Larry, what's your office think about this? And he said, we'll work with you to find a permanent solution. And that becomes the critical piece in the story because the Attorney General and the Orphans Court in Pennsylvania are the ones that had jurisdiction to solve this problem. The next call I made was to a wonderful man, Arlen Adams, a great lawyer. And he, two reasons he was important. First of all, he had solved the new era philanthropy crisis. You've never heard about this, but it was a Ponzi scheme that snared people like David Rockefeller Sr., many other very prominent individuals, and it turned out to be a Ponzi scheme. And Arlen solved this quietly, not embarrassing John Whitehead, and the list goes on of others who were involved. The second reason is because he was the only person I knew that actually knew Dr. Barnes and actually had worked on some of Dr. Barnes's legal matters. This story I'm winding up here. And once I knew that they would support us in this quest, we then talked to Bernie Watson, the chair of the board, and off we went. And we said, we will pay all the legal bills, and we will pay basically the operating costs, but there are two criteria. The board has to be expanded from 5 to, I think it was 9 at the time. The collection has to be moved into an accessible home in Philadelphia. And if you are willing to, approach the court with this, we will be your partner every step of the way. But what I didn't know is the litigation would go on from 01 to 06. The legal bills were not inappropriate, but eye-popping and staggering because of the most important thing is that we didn't allow anyone to get standing because that would have tied this up in appeals for a very long time. Fast forward, the Orphans Court, the judge there distinguished himself from in approving this. He took huge, huge flack for doing so. Everybody sort of debated, well, you're breaking Dr. Barnes's will. There are two things that never really came out in any of the press coverage. And if any of you are ever tempted, they actually made a movie about this. I don't know that it's still available. Art of the Steal. No, not half as bad. I'm not half as bad as they said. But the two things that never came out in any of that is that Dr. Barnes said in his will, if it is ever determined that my wishes cannot be carried out, that is, the collection left where it is and used the way it is, please, please do not sell any pieces of art, but move it into or near Philadelphia into the care of an organization that can take care of it. He put an escape clause, and that's never discussed, at least in any of the media. Secondly, people talk about it being all about Dr. Barnes's wishes. And donors come to me and ask about this, and I say, look, if you want to be able to control from the grave, bless you. But don't ask for a charitable deduction then, because once you basically ask for a charitable deduction, the public has a right in terms of how that estate is managed. And it was determined that the public did not have access and that the collection would not be able to be protected in the current state. So I realized that trying to defend that position became less and less interesting. This had a racial component to it because Dr. Barnes had left one of the historically black colleges the opportunity to appoint board members. That was preserved in the litigation, but sadly, some took this on as sort of being us not being supportive of diversity and of the African-American experience with the Barnes. That was not the case. So it took lots of twists and turns along the way. I probably said more than I should. No. Jim, anything you'd add to that?
No, just that, you know, we could probably spend a couple hours on donor intent, and there is the classic tension between preserving the donor's intent that they set forth in the trust document or indenture, and then serving the public interest, where trusts do get benefits that cost society money. There are tax deductions, they're excluded from the rule against perpetuities, and they have the rights to go into the courts to enforce the donor's rights. So there is sort of on that side a societal contribution.
Well, the one sort of high drama moment, and this had gone on now for many, many years. It looked like some of the students were going to get standing and were going to try to appeal. And we had another wonderful attorney on our board at the time, Arlen Davis, who's sadly deceased now. And I said, we can't go on. I mean, another 6 years, our reputation will be in the toilet, and Lord knows what will happen to the finances. And Arlen leaned across the board table, and he said, you know what you need to do? And I said, what? He said, you need to file for a King's Bench petition. How many people in here know what a King's Bench petition is? Well, it exists in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I don't know where else, maybe 2 other states.
You still have a king?
Yeah, we do. At any rate, it allows the Supreme Court to reach down into any other jurisdiction in the entire Commonwealth, take any piece of litigation, pull it up and decide it, and that is final. And they can do it in a matter of days or weeks, or they can refuse to do it. And they did this, I think, in 2 weeks.
Yes.
2 weeks, they reached down, pulled this out of the Orphans Court, decided definitively in favor of the Orphans Court decision, and so the litigation was over.
And to trigger that, the Assistant Attorney General, Larry Barth, whom you were speaking about, and the foundation filed a petition with the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. So.
For this King's Bench. So more than you wanted, probably.
No, that's really great. I'd like to ask some of the civil procedure professors here whether, I see Guy, do you teach how to apply to the King's Bench and the Court of Exchequer and the Court of Common Pleas?
Come to Pennsylvania, we'll show it to you.
Well, that was sort of an epiphany to file that petition. That made all the difference in the world.
It did.
What about a foundation being the third-party funder of litigation? Could you talk about that? Because that's a fairly extraordinary thing, I think. It's Citibank funds litigation, and there are now hedge funds that are private equity groups that are funding in the litigation space. But it all has sort of an aura about it, not necessarily good. And I'm just wondering, did you pause on that? Like, gee, we'll be we're the Pew Trust, but we're actually a litigation funder?
We did, and we do. I mean, we funded litigation around trying to defend the campaign finance law, McCain-Feingold. We pick our places where we think the issue is not only really important and in the public interest, but also where we think we can win. The Barnes, yes. Campaign finance, no. And so it doesn't always work out the way you hope. And we think about the reputational capital we expend, because every time you do this as any organization, but as a public charity, there is a reputational risk. And I think the biggest concern I had about midway through the Barnes litigation was the reputational hit To the credit of my board, every time I would bring it up, they would say, you know, we didn't think we hired a wimp. And so that was great, because that's what you wanted to hear, that they were in the boat with you as we continued on the journey.
Has anybody here been to the new barns? I have, and some of you have, yeah. The new and the old. New and old. Yeah, the new. If you ever go to Philadelphia, it's really something to see. I don't know, Joel, do you have a provocative question here
No,
on this one?
not about this.
Oh, okay,
Somebody up there.
poke away.
Having gone to St. Joe's and being a Pennsylvania lawyer, I'm trying to remember King's Bench. But did St. Joe's have any involvement in that?
No, but they subsequently now have taken over on a 30-year lease the old Marion property with the agreement to sort of enhance the arboretum and use it for teaching purposes. So they become a quote-unquote constructive partner in the aftermath. But no one, I mean, it's so interesting. You know how this is. Everybody ran for the hills. I mean, particularly when all the press, and then it went national and international. Now, of course, success has many parents, and so everybody is sure that they were at the table in the early days. But there for a while, another part of the story, which was a wonderful part of the Philadelphia story, the court, we need to convince them that this was, if a Judge Ott made this decision, he was not going to be embarrassed by it. In other words, we were going to come up empty-handed. So we raised quietly $175 million, and we raised it from donors, and no one went public, which is extraordinary to me. So we were able to say in court, if you do this, there is money to build a new home and endow it, and to give it the financial security it needs. And a memorable moment is, in orphans court, it's not like court on TV, so he turns to me and he said, could you please turn your chair around? And excuse me, he said, and face me. And so I'm like, he's over here. So I turn around and he asked a lot of tough questions. And then he said, I just want to tell you one thing. I said, yes, sir. He said, if I decide in favor of this, I never, ever want to see your face in this court again. I was like,
That's not nice.
well, I think what he was meaning is this would be so radical that failure here is not an option. In other words, not having the resources to set this straight.
Very interesting. I mean, it's an unusual, very unusual for a foundation, I think, to get involved at this level in orphans court. But the combination with the state attorney general, I suppose that's what really probably got you going, is the fact that the attorney general would be supportive.
Well, not to digress too much, but Larry and I had sort of done 3 deals before. And one was Saving the Dream Garden, which Steve Wynn wanted to move to Las Vegas, which is this fabulous Tiffany mosaic, the size of this room. So saving that. Then the Gross Clinic, which we didn't cotton to. Mrs. Walton wanted to move to Bentonville, which is a very famous Aikens painting. And there'd been a couple others, and at the end of the last one, when Larry called, and we really didn't know each other, this was kind of one of these, phone relationships, and Larry said, if you ever figure out something for the barns, call me. And I laughed, and I said, yeah, you're kind of nuts. And he laughed and said, I know. And it was like a month went by later, and I called and said, how serious were you? And he said, very. So, I think knowing that they had jurisdiction, I mean, if they hadn't been there and he hadn't had that kind of sway and willingness to support this, we would have never started down this road.
It's a kind of law practice you don't normally think of, that here you are in the state attorney general's office and you're thinking, how can we preserve the art treasures of the state of Pennsylvania? It's kind of neat. Anybody have any? We can move along. I'm wondering, Rich, what you think of this comment that if you take a deduction, then you're subjecting yourself to a higher degree of regulation. Is that actually the case?
So as a practical matter, it certainly is. You are subject to all of the rules that apply to nonprofit organizations, of which there are a great many. As a policy question, should that be the case? I think so, sure. There's a public subsidy involved, and anytime you get the public subsidy involved, there's accountability that would presumably go with it.
Good, okay. Well, you did good on that one. Okay, so.
I've been saying that a lot. I'm glad it holds some water.
I think if there is a movie about it, I think there's a book about it
Yes,
too, isn't
yes.
there? I mean,
Several.
it's actually worth looking at. You have no idea what a controversy this was in Philadelphia, because I can remember going there as a judge and I would hear about it, and a lot of judges got dragged into this, and it was, it could be very tough on your reputation. And as you say, there were just warring parties here. It got very fierce and unpleasant.
Oh, my husband, wonderful man, he said about halfway through it, he says, I just request one thing. I said, what's that? He said, we're creating a Barnes-free zone in our house. No discussion of it because we have to survive.
That's great.
And David, it wasn't just a controversy in Philadelphia. The arts world really picked it up in New York, international circles as well. So it was really controversial all over in those circles.
I guess I have a question. At the time it was launched, or you and Larry shook hands, did you anticipate that it would be so protracted and public in terms of?
Oh, heavens, no. And one of the partners in this was a wonderful woman, Lee Annenberg, who was both generous and really quite a wonderful lady. And she would call me about every 2 weeks. She'd always start with dear. And she'd go, dear, dear. And I was like, oh. And she said, can't you make them stop saying those awful things about us? And I mean, it just, the onion just kept unpeeling because everybody had an opinion, and most of the opinions were negative. And, we were not prepared for the media machine that got unleashed on us. And, I think if we did it again, we might be a little more prepared.
Lee Annenberg was the widow of Walter Annenberg.
So, that's it's actually, it probably encapsulates within it, we don't have time to go through all of it, but the whole public relations aspect to maintaining a case like that and maintaining the morale of your supporters and the Attorney General, and to some extent the judge, who was probably an elected official, through 5 years of sort of brutal negative publicity is, it's an art in itself. It's a little bit like what happened here before I got here. You get one of these cases, this was the lacrosse case, and it just takes on a life of its own, and it becomes sort of an unstoppable force in some way until it's spent.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
David, Rich has a question.
Yeah, Rich.
I'd add a little bit of color to the controversy and an aspect that hasn't come up so far, which is that Barnes was kind of an outlier at the time. He was one of the first to perceive the value in Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings, and so was able to acquire them fairly reasonably, I guess, certainly by today's standards. But he was always feuding with the Philadelphia art establishment, and one reflection of that is that one of the provisions of his trust was one that disqualified several categories of people from ever serving as trustees of the Barnes Foundation, including anybody who was on the faculty at Penn, Swarthmore, Bryn Mawr, or Villanova. They'd always had this kind of outlaw quality to them within the Philadelphia establishment, and I think there are echoes of that in the litigation over.
He also had factories where, with workers, he would place some of the art in those factories. He was a very anti-union type person, like a lot of industrials and business people of the day. But some of his art, he would think, this is how I live.
Impossible to go along with. Actually, he worked his way through every institution in making them the sort of group that would be able to nominate after he was gone. And there was a letter in his possession when he was killed in a car accident that Lincoln was being taken out. So the only reason, obviously, that was, I don't know who would have been next, but he...
Lincoln University.
Very hard,
Yeah.
very hard to get along with.
Yeah. Just as an aside, if you go to the Barnes, which I encourage you to do, you'll see that he had theories of art. So you have an Impressionist painting, and then you'll have a doorknob under it, because he saw some connection between that doorknob or a hinge or some kind of worked metal or piece of wood carving, and he saw some kind of resonance between that
and the art is hung exactly as it was when he passed. And I did have a number of donors saying, hey, I've got $10 million for you or 15 million, but I'm not putting it in if you're going to hang that art in that cruddy way. And I am like, well, you know, there's the door, because if you think we're going to be able to get that through, even if we would want to. So there were certain accommodations made, including the doorknobs.
There's the donor intent.
Yeah, there you go.
So let's talk about Pew, and let's go back to Joel's question. You had 7 trusts
4 people.
and 4 offspring.
Right.
This is the Sun Oil or Sunoco. This is the family that made, I guess, a good deal of money in the oil business, and then wanted to do something philanthropic with religious motivation, I think, originally. And so tell the tale.
So the reason for the 7, thank you for yielding the floor, is 4 children. They wanted to create the largest trust together to honor their parents. There were 4 others that they each created themselves. I think that's 5. There was one very small trust for educational purposes, which I think pretty much now is we don't manage. And then a final trust, which J. Howard Pugh set up to support religious causes and his other interests, which were conservative, sort of limited forms of government, traditional American values, a range of other things. So there are 4 that are specific to them, 1 for the parents. I've left 1 out, I can't remember. But anyway, so that's why there's 7. And that becomes important to the story. So
Yes,
maybe
it
I'll
does.
just jump in. So there are these 7 trusts, which we were managing, and every year go to the IRS and say, why do you make us file 7 different tax returns? I mean, it's all the same work. I should mention that we'd grown from an organization in the early 80s with a staff of 3 to today we're about 1,200 and doing very different kind of work than we did then, though still a commitment to Philadelphia. But to the story about the public charity. So why do you make us file 7 different tax returns? It's expensive, you know, whatever. And we'd always pull up the IRS guy who would explain politely, you're 7 different organizations. So you have to file 7 different returns. That becomes important to the story. So, you know, you would lick your wounds and off you would go. Through the work of some really brilliant lawyers, we were sitting down and I was whining about what we couldn't do that we wanted to do. We wanted to be more proactive in our work. We wanted to operate our programs directly. When the facts were clear, we wanted to be able to take our case to Congress or to the State House. It would be nice if we could actually raise money from other donors. So I went on, and they said, well, you want to be a public charity. Now, different private foundations or, you know, Ford, Rockefeller, Gates, the money usually comes from one donor, and they do have limitations to what they can do. And we can get into that if you're interested. Public charity is every other nonprofit you know. And they have much greater flexibility in operating, but there are some requirements as well. So he said, you want to be a public charity? And I was like, well, yeah. So he said, well, you know, you already meet what's called the public support test because you have 7 different donors funding you already. And those donors were siblings, not lineal descendants. If they were lineal descendants, it wouldn't count, a la father, son, daughter. So they said right up front, I don't see how the IRS could argue that you don't meet the public support test on their, I don't know how much detail to get into.
That's good.
And you meet it, so file for it. Now, why do you want to be a public charity? For us, we were then able to raise money directly, and we do raise about $60 million from the outside donors. We could operate our programs directly, which we do, all of our national and international work. And third, we can lobby. Ooh, you thought litigation was bad. We can lobby, which we do on some 25 different topics when we think the facts are clear and we are pushing for a change in regulation or litigation. That's why Jim had no gray hair when he left Hogan, but he's got a little bit now. So I think the endless calls we got from trust and estates lawyers saying, we want to do this too. There's no required payout. Private foundations have a 5% payout. Public charities don't. We pay out a lot more than that. That was not the purpose of it. But it's just so much more ability, we believe, to be impactful. Unless you found 4 or 5 kids who all liked each other and all wanted to donate a lot of money and then try to create one of these, I don't know exactly how. Certainly any existing private foundation would be impossible for them to do this.
But did you, I don't think you did, but it would be nice if you set up the IRS. Like you went to them and said, we want to file
Oh,
one,
sure.
we want to file one return, knowing they would say, no, you are 7 independent parallel trusts and you have to file 7 independent returns and because you're all separate. And then you
Oh.
say, fine,
Oh.
we have 7 separate donors, we're a public charity, and then they can't say anything.
Sometimes it's just good enough to be lucky.
But you sort of hoist them on their own.
In this case, the conversations were remembered, and they weren't going to, because it was in the file, and they weren't going to change, obviously, their opinion. But I wish I could say I was that creative. Can't claim credit for that.
Jim, were you around when this happened?
I was not around. I've been at Pew a little over 5 years as their GC, but I have had to go back and certainly have read the files avidly. I think what I found so interesting is, you know, the Pew Charitable Trust has been around a very long time. The first trust was set up in 1948. But in fact, the legal entity, the Pew Charitable Trust, it was not incorporated until the year 2002. And what existed previously, and it was really a doing business as, it was these 7 separate trusts that were operated as a division of the trust company that had been set up by the Pew family. So, you know, what great lawyering who came up with the idea and said, geez, you want to do all these things that a public charity can do, but a private foundation can't do. How can we do that and assure you right out of the box compliance with the public support test as a publicly supported charity?
Yeah, had we not had that assurance, I don't think the board would have taken the risk. And to the board's credit, a public charity needs to have a public board. And so they were willing to give up seats in control. And so 1/3 of the board needs to be, actually now is 50%, not members of the Pew family or related. So, you know, for them, they get a lot of credit. They saw what they thought would be the greater good in these resources serving the public interest. And they were willing to do that.
It was a very brave transaction, though, because you didn't know whether you could raise money either. I mean, it's one of the wealthiest private foundations around. And then being a publicly supported charity, one of the requirements is that you have to be organized and operated to continue to raise funds publicly. So you couldn't, I think, forever just rely on the distributions from the trust.
And as one aside, these 2 pieces of litigation, the Barnes and this they were going on pretty much at the same time. So then the conspiracy theorists said, because we were accepting funds from all these donors for the Barnes, they said the whole reason they did the Barnes was to ensure that they would have their public charity status. And I was like, oh my gosh, but that I was that creative. No, and so there was a lot of interest in these 2 unique transactions, which actually did in some ways intersect.
Rebecca, how long did it take for you all to decide to petition for public charity status after, I mean, you were turned down a number of different years by the IRS. What actually triggered the decision, and how long was it before you decided to go for the public charity status?
Really months, and it required 2 things. This trustee that Jim mentioned, the Glenmead Trust Company, the guy that ran it he was a friend, but we had our differences. We had to join hands, and he had to be sure that they were going to continue to be the trustee, and we were no way going to try to change that. And that would have been a deal breaker. I had to have him agree that they were going to pay us more than 5% a year, a smidgen more, in perpetuity, because I wasn't interested in doing this, and all of a sudden the trustee cuts off. So there were a lot of deals that had to be brokered. Deals with the board about the ones that were serving would have continue to have their life terms. Any new family members and everyone else would have regular terms. So there were a lot of, but amazingly, I think it was really no more than 9 months to get all these sort of things that were really more about our internal politics and governance. And then we filed, and of course we did have friends in the courts locally, and the IRS was pretty efficient. You know, they looked at the case and they said, we can't believe it, but guess what? On every point, you qualify. And so it wasn't debatable.
They certified it several times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what then happened? You know, as a result of that, how did the entity change? It's obvious that it's dramatic, but I'd just be interested in how that unfolded.
So we went from being having a staff of about 100 people, making grants, and so when we wanted to accomplish something, we would make a grant, so we would outsource. And we knew how to do that pretty well. Well, you know, change comes at you fast, and I was not prepared for this. We went from being a grant-making organization to telling our staff that they had a choice now, to 4 years later, outsourcing virtually none of the national and international work, recruiting and building up a staff, domestic and international, and going from a staff of 100 to now, with the Pew Research Center, what are we, 1,200 about?
1,200, yeah.
And we didn't have the infrastructure to support this or anything. So, I mean, we were literally driving the bus and the wheels weren't on it. It was, I mean, standing up a whole fundraising effort. We'd never raised a dime in our life. And then going to the board and telling them we wanted to use the permission to lobby. And that was a long conversation. And now we have a staff in government relations of, I don't know, 30?
Yeah.
As I mentioned, sort of lobbying on any number of issues. So it was a lot of, it had huge implications. And to be completely candid, I was totally unprepared for this. It came at me way faster. And periodically, our then head of finance came into me one day and he said, what is it you don't understand about what's happened here in complexity? We've gone from one currency and one bank account to operating in 14 currencies with 9 banks around the globe. He said, what is it you don't understand about the fact that this place is different? So we had to learn, and Jim came in, not at the end of it, because it's still been changing, but we've had to grow into this opportunity.
Are there other foundations that have followed in your path that are of the same prominence? I suppose some have, but is there anything else that's like this?
Well, people are trying new creative models. I'm not sure I completely understand the Zuckerberg model. People are still trying to sort it out. It's different. People are looking at new tools and ways. It would be impossible for a private foundation with one donor to do this. So it just legally. So, but there are a lot of people looking at innovative new ways to use charitable resources for the public good.
You're talking
In a
about
way.
Chan Zuckerberg?
Yeah.
I don't, can you speak to that, Joel?
Yeah, no, well, Chan Zuckerberg really, they've not done anything. They've made individual grants. But the total figure they were using at the beginning was that they were going to give away during their lifetimes the value of their Facebook stock, which was valued at that point at $45 billion.
Less now.
Yeah. But the $45 billion basically stayed in the LLC, basically for all practical purposes in their own personal bank account for all practical purposes. There was no taxable event or tax beneficial event that occurred for most of it. Then they started giving away, but they've doled it out in modest amounts, like $1 billion. But the fact is, what you're seeing is that there are a number of things like, for example, the Omidyar Network, which Pierre Omidyar started a foundation. He found it constraining because he wanted to do things, perhaps make grants to or invest in for-profit corporations which produced a double or triple bottom line. And so basically, he paid less attention to the foundation, started creating 501c4s and also donor-advised funds, basically. So he has a suite of vehicles with which to do different kinds of things that can be permitted by the legal nature of the vehicles. So in a sense, I think that I would add that a typical private foundation where the donor is dead can't do this. Where there are family members, or if there is a living donor, there are lots of things they can do. And Julian Robertson basically pays the salary of the president of the Robertson Foundation, and he's permitted to lobby. I was surprised when the IRS decided, or actually never acted on it, to permit a foundation that cannot lobby to have its president be able to lobby simply because of the fact that his or her salary is being paid by the donor still alive. So if the donor is still alive, there are lots of options there, but not a foundation where the donor is dead, basically.
So would it be helpful to use 2 examples of what we've done with it? And then I do want to give Jim a minute, and you guys have been really patient. We're doing too much talking. So let me use our corrections reform work. This was about 14 years ago, 12 years ago. Staff came to me and said, you know, we're locking up way, way too many people, and particularly people with low-level offenses. We want to take this on. I was like, forget it. Forget it. We're going to be the soft on crime crowd. This is going to be a reputation killer. We pride ourselves for being viewed as, someone once called us, raging moderates, and, you know, no ideology, no politics. At any rate, they convinced me that this was an economic argument, and that's how they were going to go forward, that there was a way to have low-level offenders pay their debt to society in a much more economical way, and that we would be able to get a lot of conservatives to champion this agenda. And they were exactly right. Our first state in was Texas. We now have, I think, close to 30 states in, and many, many billions of dollars saved because of prisons aren't being built. It's now become a cause with a lot of champions, everything from, you know, Open Society to the Koch brothers and whatever. We're now pivoting to juvenile justice and also situations in jails and getting people, the whole bail system. There are other places we think we can direct our attention, because we like to get in when an issue is orphaned but ripe. But once it's sort of reached the tipping point, it's time for us to move on and let others continue. So this is work we could never have done as a private foundation directly. Required lobbying, required putting together coalitions, Right on Crime, others to sort of support the work. I'll mention just one other quickly, and that's our work in voting. We got involved after the hanging Chad debacle, thinking about what we could do to improve confidence in and the whole elections system. Created a system whereby states now can bring their voter rolls together, and through data sharing can get the dead people off the rolls and keep the rolls more up to date and clean, and that's now self-supporting. Many other projects. I'll just mention one that's my favorite. Harry Truman was the first one to talk about this as a national disgrace, that the men and women serving in harm's way could not vote for their commander-in-chief and others overseas, because we had a system that just would not allow them to get their ballot, vote, and get it back. And that is a national disgrace. And we got that fixed, working with the Department of Defense and the states that have the most military voters. Maybe not the biggest thing we've done, but again, we would not have been able to do that without this flexibility. And we have a big environmental program, 2 of my quick favorites, a goal of setting aside 1 billion acres in the boreal forest in Canada. That's a lot. And we're at 880 million at this point. And again, that partnership with industry and with indigenous peoples and such wouldn't have been possible. And the other is the first generation of parks in the sea, just like parks on land. Our goal is 15 by 2022. We're at 9 now. These are big. I mean,
How many miles? How many
yeah,
square
think
miles?
of them like as 3 or 4 times bigger than Texas. I mean, big. And it's important for all kinds of ecological reasons. And again, that would not have been doable, though Jim is still wondering how he's going to find another lawyer in New Caledonia to pass on his lobbying rules. But can we just
We do have an office there, so.
would it be helpful for
Yeah,
Jim to
of
say
course.
a word or
Yeah.
two?
Yeah, I'll also.
Talk about yourself a little bit, too.
Okay, thank you. I'd also say, you know, creative lawyering, it's so important, but if you picked up something here, a creative lawyer is helpless if he or she does not have a creative client. And a client willing to take chances, a client pressing the lawyer to think outside the box, and furthermore, a client willing to expend the resources to support out of the box and new things, because frankly, that type of work is expensive and time consuming. So it's very much a partnership in these things. I can say, and you again heard just, and Rebecca's conversation here on the work could go on much longer in terms of the variety of projects we do. It is so much fun working there and coming in and seeing the huge range of projects at the organization. I think it's taken me, and unfortunately it keeps changing, so I think I've caught up, and then but it probably took me 2 years to figure out what the portfolio of work was. And frankly, from a lawyer's perspective, areas I and my team needed to focus on, and areas I could sort of just check in periodically. Just in looking back at my career, and to give you context, I graduated law school in 1984, so slightly over 30 years ago. But some takeaways for me, for sure, have been at least spend some of your career, and for those intending to spend all of it in public service, I applaud you. But I've never seen anyone, and for part of my career, I worked in the government. I was Bob Dole's counsel in his leadership office. But no one's ever regretted those experiences. And you'll hear someone, former colleagues of mine at the law firm I worked at for 25 years who, they were securities lawyers, but boy, did they love to tell me stories at the SEC during the big M&A days, So don't hold back on that. I know, at least speaking for myself, lawyers tend to be risk averse, but I think with your own personal planning, and I would also say try not to overplan your life, because lawyers have a habit of trying to do that too, I think. But do take chances and do throw yourself into the public interest area at some point. Some other things I think is always make sure that you're pursuing your dreams. Even if they don't all come true, there is great valor and nobility in just putting yourself out there, and you'd be surprised what happens. Always make sure you're learning something in your job, honing your skills, getting challenges. If you feel you might be getting in a rut or things sort of stagnating, take charge of it. And again, I was a partner at Hogan Lovells for about 23, 24 years, and loved working there, wonderful colleagues. But and I'm an M&A lawyer by training, but the last 10 years of my practice, I kept thinking, I'd like to do something different. I'd like to experiment. And I wasn't quite sure that would be, but I reached out, and I wanted to learn more about the nonprofit space. I'd always been a public company lawyer. And I reached out. Hogan had a great education practice and healthcare practice, and there are a lot of nonprofits in that space. And I reached out to some of my partners, and I said, if you have any transactions coming down the road, or you guys have any governance issues, give me a call. I'd be happy to help you out. So that led to, 10 years. And I stayed in the public company space, but I started working a lot more with nonprofits. One in particular doing a disposition of several lines of business that I wanted to get out of. And one, I got the kick out of the mission, which I'd never experienced before, and I loved it. And I also loved the clients. They were just so committed to what they did. And that mission drive sort of, again, sort of a synergy transferred over to me. So I decided I wanted to do more in that space and had the good fortune of connecting with Rebecca, and the rest is history.
And the advice I got from my board chair, who had run a large public company, he said the very best lawyers are those that help you always get to yes, but when they say no, you don't even need to continue the conversation. So, and Jim's helped me get to yes more times than I can count.
Rebecca, I remember that you invited, I don't know how many members of Congress to come together across their parties some years ago. Would you reflect on that? That's something that foundations don't do either.
So we had a project where we would take members of Congress off on retreat. And my board reminds me periodically, asked me whether I'm planning an in-depth evaluation to see how effective that was. It was to encourage bipartisanship and civility. I like to tell them it might be worse if we hadn't done that. But not to give up, never admit defeat unless it's real. We actually have a whole series, we were talking about this earlier, a whole series of projects. We don't talk a lot about them publicly. We call them our safe spaces projects. We bring together all of the chiefs of staff in the Senate every month, and then we take them on retreat once a year. We get about 80 of the 100 to participate. We do the same in the House, and we do the same with members of the judiciary and the courts. And these are places where it's just a safe space for them to be together. They're often involve sort of a note program or a program that they generate, it has paid huge, huge dividends because ultimately they are all there to serve all of us, and it's been quite rewarding for them and I think encouraging for us. We are probably in our 8th or 9th year with the Senate chiefs and a shorter time with the House chiefs, and we will continue this because we think that this is really what the country needs. And you participated in
I did.
a form of one of these.
I did about a year ago. I interviewed, I moderated a panel of Justice Alito and Justice Breyer before the House Judiciary Committee, and they debated their different, they are somewhat different approaches to statutory interpretation. They're not as different as you might have expected, but they were different enough. And it was very engaging, and it was under Chatham House rules, so you can't talk about it later. It was a lot of fun for me, obviously, and it was extremely well attended. We were in the Judiciary Committee hearing room, and it was packed. And so I thought that was a tremendous Pew event. You're also active in the access to justice technology space now, too.
Very new work for us. Actually, attending a conference, and this is maybe I should have known, but the percent of the population that has access to no legal representation in sort of civil cases. I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's over 50%, and some people say as high as 70%. And no matter how wonderful firms are and lawyers in doing more pro bono work, and also organizations like your brother runs that provide services, the need can't be fully addressed. And so the question for us was, what does technology have to offer here? And the answer is a lot. Anybody here been involved with eBay and trying to go into arbitration to resolve differences? A lot of people are, and something like 90% of them get resolved just fine. There are now kiosks available and technology that can help people understand what their choices are. And we're now piloting this in 2 states with the help from the corporate sector. And we hope to be able to take this with support from the Bar Association. So we're hoping that if these pilots work and some of the other efforts we're engaged in with particularly the state courts, because this is largely in their purview, that we'll be able to take this national. The goal of all of our work is very metrics driven. So the goal end game here is 10 states adopting some form of this in the next 5 years, which we think will be a huge win, and hopefully then it will spread.
That's great. What's exciting about that project, I think the program people are hopeful. They view it as a toe in the water, and that this project could, if the toe on the water is successful, which I think everyone's optimistic it will be, this could lead to sort of other ideas and innovations in terms of helping people have greater access in the civil justice system. So people are super excited about this.
One of the great validators of the work of the Pew Charitable Trust strikes me as being the extent to which the other philanthropists, individual philanthropists and foundations have been willing to collaborate with Pew Trust. And if you read the current report, you see a list of those and the different areas in which they're doing it. So, if I remember correctly, Rebecca, you were actually created a donor relations group before you transformed into a public charity. And you were already raising, the last time I checked, $300 or $400 million, I think. It's now up to $1 billion. So the fact that other philanthropists who are careful about giving away their money are willing to give money to Pew to do projects that the Pew wants to do strikes me as being an extraordinarily impressive, persuasive validator of what they think about the work of the Pew Charitable Trust.
Well, generous of you to say, but we get more than we give sometimes. I'm not just talking about money. These are very talented, smart, successful people. And so they are stress testing our ideas. They're demanding the results that we say we're going to try and deliver. They're asking tough questions. So I think we've really gained in terms of the rigor and the strategic approach as much as from the resources.
There's only one other foundation that is comparable to what you're doing, and that's the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation, with its growth philanthropy aggregators, which has now raised $1 billion in commitments to work in the youth development world. But you look in vain. I mean, while Pew is not a foundation any longer, it does things that operating foundations have done in the past. But you look for that kind of collaborations among other foundations, you don't see it.
Rebecca, when you're done with Pew, you could come over here. You wouldn't have to raise $1 billion a year. We could maybe half.
So, so I need to tell you, so I asked the dean what part of his job gave him the most joy. I'm gonna tell stories out of school now. Not sure fundraising was on the list, but he did say the chance to work with such a supportive, generous, competent faculty, and to be playing such an important role with such great students, that had been the two things that had given him the most joy in his 11 years here. And I think over dinner he said he was signing up for another 11. Was that right?
Definitely not.
We have not honored. We
That
said
wouldn't be good.
We said we're not going to take some questions about anything. Yes.
Yep, there we go.
So on the fundraising front, can you talk a little bit about the process of soliciting contributions? Are you dealing directly with philanthropists and donors, or do they have representation that you mostly work through?
It depends. We have individual philanthropists that approach us directly, and then we have some that have small to very large staffs, and some of our donors are private foundations. We had an anonymous donor reach out through their lawyer and basically said, look, you've been trying to get this right for 70 years. I don't want to sort of try to do it myself, so can I put my resources on your platform? You know, these are areas that I generally have an interest in. And so we have people providing support directly through a click on the Pew Research Center's website. So the contributions range from $25 to $250 million. I mean, and there's all kinds of everything in between, and you know, but we have a fundraising staff of, I'm going to guess, about 35, all of them with experience. Yeah. All of them with experience in various sectors. I mean, trust and estates lawyers are a real target for us because they're advising clients, and they've been very generous. Just had an interesting lawyer approach us. A client, her son was beheaded by ISIS, and the settlement yielded many millions for her. She's a modest woman of very modest means, and she doesn't want this money, but she wants it deployed for the public good and to honor her son. And so the combination of the lawyer and her investment advisor reached out to us. So it's there's really it's a real mix. Yes.
Jerry, and then.
I'm just curious to know what Pew is doing now in the field of access to medicine.
We're doing a lot of work on specific issues, electronic medical records. Big problem. If we could fix that, millions, billions would be saved, and access would be greatly improved. Slow going, but working on it. Safety of medical devices. The one that I'm particularly interested in is the whole problem of the antibiotics pipeline, and we take 80% of our antibiotics in this country and feed it to animals to make them grow faster, and it's destroying the antibiotics that we have, their efficacy. And there are no new antibiotics in the pipeline because there's no money in it. So one drug, you go to your doctor and they say, please don't take it, or only take it for 10 or 14 days. So if you're a pharmaceutical executive, that's the last place you're going to want to put your R&D money. So we, and a range of other issues, what we aren't working on is getting people better access or the healthcare insurance issue. There are a lot of other people that are, and we figure they'll do it better than we, like Robert Wood Johnson and many others.
How about food safety?
Yes, we worked hard on food safety. Got legislation passed, the first in about 45 years. Our biggest partner in that was the Grocery Manufacturers Association, explaining to Congress that people getting poisoned by peanut butter or spinach is not good for business. Took forever to get the legislation through. But then what took longer was to get the appropriations and actually the Obama administration to sort of sign off on the regulations. But we got that completed and we had ourselves all set for meat and poultry with Cargill as our big partner. Working with industry is key when you're moving into the regulatory space. You're not going to win if you have them lined up against you. And Cargill was supportive, and Walmart has been great on this. They've got a big proactive food safety group. And I was just talking to our colleagues, I think we're going to pull the work. The climate is just not what it needs to be for us to be able to push this forward, but you don't want to know how bad it is, meat and poultry, and our lack of ability to make sure that our food supply is safe. Because you did just have your lunch. But
Well, we did, and I think it was meat and poultry.
Yeah.
We're at the witching hour. That was fantastic. Apologies. Maybe you could come down and ask the question. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you for coming.